Today marks the 9-year anniversary of one of the worst mass killings in the war on terrorism. The Camp Speicher Massacre occurred on June 12, 2014, when the Islamic State killed between 1,095 people to 1,700 Iraqi cadets in an attack on Camp Speicher in Tikrit, Iraq. At the time of the massacre, there were between 5,000 and 100,000 unarmed cadets in the camp, and Islamic State fighters selected the Shia and non-Muslims for execution. It is the second deadliest act of terrorism in history, only surpassed by the attacks of September 11, 2001. Several survivors would later testify that their senior officers in the camp had forced them to leave the camp. Hassan Khalil, one survivor who managed to escape by pretending to be dead under another corpse and fleeing at night, would say, quote, "Our chief officers are the reason behind the killings. They forced us to leave Speicher. They assured us that there was safe passage and that it was guarded by the tribes. And they told us not to wear any uniforms. Instead, they sold us to the Islamic State," end quote. The Iraqi government and national television denied the story. They said the cadets forced their way out of the camps after the military had already dispatched special forces to the dangerous camps area to secure them, and that they had been warned against leaving. 400 cadets ordered to leave Camp Speicher before the attack were arrested by government forces and are missing. Ali Hussein Qadim, an Iraqi soldier and a Shiite, was captured with hundreds of other soldiers by the Islamic State in June and taken to the grounds of a palace complex in Tikrit, where Saddam Hussein once lived. The Sunnis were allowed to repent for their service to the government. The Shiites, however, were marked for death and lined up in groups. Mr. Qadim was number 4 in line. As the firing squad shot the first man, blood had spurted out on Qadim's face. He remembered seeing a video camera in the hands of another militant. He would say, "I saw my daughter in my mind saying, 'Father, Father.'" He then felt a bullet pass by his head and fell forward into the freshly dug trench. "I just pretended to be shot," he said. A few moments later, Mr. Qadim said that one of the killers walked amongst the bodies and saw that one man who had been shot was still breathing. One militant told him, "Just let him suffer. He's an infidel, Shia. Let him suffer, let him bleed." Qadim would say to himself, at that point, "I had a great will to live." He waited about 4 hours, he said, until it was dark and there was only silence. About 200 yards away from the edge of the Tigris River, he made it to the riverbank, where the reeds gave him some cover. There he met an injured man named Abbas, a driver at Camp Speicher, who had been shot by militants and shoved into the river. Mr. Qadim stayed there 3 days with Abbas, who was so badly wounded he could barely move. Mr. Qadim ate insects and plants, but Abbas was in too much pain to eat much of anything. Qadim would later describe it as 3 days of hell. Qadim planned his escape while Abbas begged him to come back for him, and if he could not, at least tell his story. As Qadim was leaving, Abbas yelled to him, "Let everyone know what happened here." Peter Buchart, the emergency director for Human Rights Watch, stated, quote, "The photos and satellite images from Tikrit provide strong evidence of a horrible war crime that needs further investigation. ISIS and other abusive forces should know that the eyes of Iraqis and the world are watching. End quote. According to Berthawa News, based out of Iraq, the massacre of Army recruits outside Camp Speicher in June was unprecedented, even by the standards of 10 years of sectarian war in Iraq, and it created a state of panic in the country and sent a message to the world that the fighters of the Sunni organization are a new kind of enemy that insists not only on seizing and keeping the land, but also on eliminating its enemies from other sects where they fall hands into its fighters. The survivors of the massacres and the relatives of the martyrs believe that the killers themselves are not only culprits, they also blamed the government and tribal leaders in the Salahuddin province, saying that they promised the recruits a safe passage from Al Qaeda to the south, but instead allowed them to be led to their death. Government officials dispute these accounts, saying there was no promise of safe passage and that the unarmed recruits, left the safety of these bases despite the orders to stay. One commander claimed that the mass killings were the responsibility of those who left the bases. One commander who managed to survive the massacre said, quote, "They forced us to leave Camp Speicher." End quote. Muhammad Hamoud, another survivor who returned to Diwania, said he blamed both the Salah al-Din tribes and our own military leaders. He also added, "If we had weapons, no one would have been able to take Camp Speicher or Tikrit or all the places close to it. We were 4,000, and it was not possible for a force to confront us. But we were unarmed, and then we were sold, and then cheated of our lives." More than 100 relatives of the missing went to Baghdad a few days after the massacre and stormed Parliament, angry at the government's failure to inform them of the state and the fate of their relatives. They gave us their bodies. The relatives of the victims stashed what they could in graves, beating everyone they thought was a deputy and chanting, accusing officials and even legislators of being thieves and having sold their children in Salah al-Din. One of the family members would say, quote, "We asked the government, the parliament, and the outgoing prime minister, every influential official, where are our children? If they are alive, tell us. If they are dead, at least give us their bodies." End quote. The Islamic State released footage of the massacre as part of their propaganda video entitled "Upon the Prophetic Methodology," a video that I have personally seen myself, where the cadets are seen being crammed into trucks, some of them wearing civilian clothes to hide their military uniforms, trembling before them, the dark eyes of their killers, most of them lying on the ground with their jeans stripped, which revealed camouflage uniforms underneath. Some of the prisoners were even forced to defame Iraqi's Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki, while others were forced to shout, "Long live the Islamic State." Some of them were beaten to rifle until death. Others were shot in their extremities to suffer before being shot by an AK-47 by a passerby. The killing methods varied from shooting the cadets one by one to shooting them while lying down many times to ensure death. Some cadets were shot bent over and then thrown into the Tigris River, where the ground was saturated with their blood. The Iraqi government said that 57 members of the Arab Socialist Ba'athist Party had taken part in the massacre, although pictures showed that every armed man was not from the Arab Socialist Ba'athist Party, but was from ISIS. The government still stated, quote, without any doubts and suspicion, all of these criminals are from the banned Ba'athist Party, end quote. The Minister of Defense, Saudun al-Dolami, stated that the massacre was not sectarian in nature, although the spokesman of the Iraqi Armed Forces, Qasem Atta, stated that there were almost 11,000 cadets and soldiers missing from Camp Speicher. He also stated that thousands were executed in or near the presidential palaces, the Al-Jil region, and the Badouche prison by sectarian violence. Days later, on September 2nd, more than 100 members of the families killed stormed the parliament and hit 3 of the security guards in another act of revenge and violence. 2 weeks later, the Kurdish Azadiyef arrested 4 people suspected to be involved in the massacre in southern Kirkuk. An unnamed security source would later say, quote, the operation was executed by relying on intelligence information to arrest them, end quote. On September 18th, the Iraqi Human Rights Ministry stated that as of September 17th, 2014, the total number of missing soldiers and cadets feared killed was anywhere between 1,095 to 1,700. The ministry added, quote, the ministry relied in its statistics on spreading forms on the families of the missing people in Baghdad and the other government within its quest to document the crimes and violations that the terrorist group of the Islamic State is committing towards our people, end quote. Following the Iraqi forces' victory over the Islamic State in Tikrit in early April 2015, mass graves containing some of the murdered cadets were located, and the decomposed corpses began to be exhumed. On August 22nd, 2016, Iraq had hanged 36 men convicted of the 2014 massacre at Camp Speicher. They had been found guilty of involvement in the massacre, named after a base near Tikrit. A spokesman for the governor's office in Tikrit, the province of which Nasiriyah was the capital, quote, the executions of 36 men convicted over the Camp Speicher crime was carried out this morning in Nasiriyah prison. The governor of Tikrit, Yahya al-Nasiri, and Justice Minister Haider al-Zamili were present to oversee their executions. They were transferred to Nasiriyah last week, and the president approved of the executions, end quote. For Mohammed Hammoud, however, he still suffers from the psychological wounds inflicted on him by the ordeal, in which his days now seem like a dream. I keep thinking, was this a dream or reality? Am I really still alive?